So 4 years ago, my PhD advisor calls me into his office and he says, "Hey, Aldi, Oculus just sent me one of their first VR headsets. I don't know what to do with it. Do you want it?" So yes, I wanted it. And being the responsible scientist that I am, obviously the first thing I used it for was to play Minecraft. Now, the Oculus DK1 had rotation tracking, but no position tracking. But you could finagle position tracking if you bought these third-party motion controllers and strapped them to your head. So I'm sitting in the lab, wires going everywhere, these weird third-party scripts that are running Minecraft and VR. And I'll never forget that first moment that I peeked my head around a Minecraft cube, because that was the closest thing I had ever experienced to magic. And I realized in that moment I wanted to devote my career to pursuing this technology and seeing how it could help us understand just human behavior and cognition. A little bit about my background. In 2015, I got a PhD in psychology specializing in cognitive neuroscience at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. I was zapping people's brains with direct current electricity while they played brain training games. It made them better at the brain training games, but not better at anything else, so mixed results. Then while I was there, I used my DK1 to found a VR research lab. This is one of the first things I ever made in Unity. This is with the Oculus, this is with the DK2 actually, an Elite Motion hand tracker. And then studying brain training and doing VR stuff, it didn't take me long to realize the potential of VR for brain training, so I co-founded a company. And we made brain training video games to the Samsung Gear VR. I did the whole San Francisco startup thing, got venture capital funding, was part of an incubator, had a booth at TechCrunch Disrupt, the whole thing. And I realized a little bit too late that I hated it, that all the stuff that I really love doing, like research and game design and programming, you don't get to do any of that as CEO of a startup. I spent half my time writing emails, the other half fundraising. But luckily, around the same time, I got headhunted by IBM, where I spent the past year and a half doing ridiculous stuff like made a proof of concept juggling trainer to show that you could learn things in VR that would transfer to the real world. A study on the effects of stress and relaxation in VR on cognition, though this one never quite made it past the ethics review board. Then one where you used brain activity to slow down time to make things easier to hit with a virtual slingshot. To just prototyping random game ideas. I call this one Portal Ball. You play it with an actual couche racket with a Vive tracker on it. We did photogrammetry on it. This one was actually pretty fun. To just messing with the fabric of space-time. This is my attempt to try to solve the locomotion problem in VR of how we get people from one scene to another without making them motion sick. And it works pretty well. To the most recent project I've been working on, where we got Unity controlling a Roomba with Raspberry Pi, and then we designed and 3D printed a ball that you put a Vive tracker into that you throw into it for what we're tentatively calling VR 3D printed Roomba basketball. I promise we have hypotheses, it's a whole study, but we should be collecting data in a week or two. So I wanna make sure we're on the same page when I talk about virtual reality. So VR relies on something called binocular disparity, which means literally the difference between what your two eyes see. Now, when you see a flat picture like this, your brain knows it's flat because both eyes see the same thing. And this is not how we see the real world. In the real world, our eyes are in slightly different positions, so they each get a slightly different view. You can see this yourself if you just hold up your hand and close your left and your right eye. Like my left eye sees more of my palm, my right eye sees more of my fingernail. But with both eyes open, you only see one hand. That's because our brain is really good at taking these two slightly disparate images and fusing them together into a single 3D representation. This is how we've seen everything forever. So when it's not there, you know right away that it's not real. Now VR capitalizes on this by putting a screen in front of your eyes, splitting it down the middle, and giving a slightly different image to each eye, just like we see in everyday life. Now in VR, you put on a headset and the screen is the only thing you see. In AR, you still see the world around you, you just put stuff on top of it. Now, AR headsets can still use binocular disparity, so the objects they create can feel really real, but you'll never think you're somewhere else. And then there's mixed or merged reality, which can mean whatever you want it to. A quick note on motion sickness. I'm happy to report this is a solved problem in virtual reality. There's no reason anyone ever has to get motion sick in VR. It used to be a hardware problem, but not anymore. Since the Oculus and the Vive, the hardware is good enough that nobody needs to get motion sick. Short of a hardware failure, most motion sickness in VR is caused by a discrepancy in motion cues from your eyes and your inner ear. So for example, if you're wearing a Google Cardboard and your eyes tell you you're on a roller coaster doing a loop-de-loop, but your inner ear says, nah, you're not, that's what makes you motion sick. But with room scale tracking, you have perfect one-to-one position tracking, so there's no discrepancy. I've given hundreds of VR demos, nobody ever gets sick. it is still possible to make someone sick in VR, but at this point, if you get motion sick, it's the designer's fault. So it wouldn't be a VR talk if I didn't talk about presence. Presence is the whole reason VR is worth doing, and it's what makes VR such a valuable tool for science. It's this magical thing that happens when your brain literally believes you're somewhere else. And this can sound really hand-wavy if you haven't tried good high-end room-scale VR, unless you have, in which case you know exactly what I'm talking about. One of the co-founders of YouTube does a really great job explaining it. Your brain's an idiot and VR fools it. I couldn't put it better myself. So if you were to see this on a flat screen, you might flinch a little bit. But if you see it in VR, you will duck out of the way because your brain thinks it's real, and that's how you would react in real life. If you don't believe me, this is what presence looks like when the fight or flight reflex kicks in. Now, consciously, she's perfectly aware she's safe in her living room, but when you have presence and you see a zombie behind you, your brain forgets. So this clip should demonstrate that this relates to an important idea in human research called ecological validity, which is just how much what you study in the lab accurately describes real life. Now, I hope the clip I've just shown you demonstrates that with presence in VR, we get ecologically valid behavior. You will duck out of the way or run into the corner of your living room. We also get ecologically valid physiological responses. Your pupils will dilate, your heart rate will go up, your galvanic skin response will change, just like they would in real life. And since all behavior and physiology is rooted in the brain, I'm pretty sure this means we're getting ecologically valid cognition as well. I cannot overstate how much of a game-changing goldmine this is for human research. Until now, if we wanted to study the cognitive neuroscience of memory, it looked like this. This is with EEG. It gets even worse if you want to use fMRI. So I spent all of grad school running subjects through studies like this, and I couldn't shake this nagging thought that wheeling people into a tube and having them memorize lists of words through angled mirrors and responding on a button box has very little to do with real life. And I think VR largely solved this problem. Now, having said that, presence is easy to get, but hard to maintain. I think once you reach a certain minimum hardware benchmark, you basically get presence for free until you mess it up, but it's real easy to mess up. I really like how Jesse Schell describes presence as like this beautiful, fragile soap bubble floating through a desert of cacti just trying to ruin its day. So a good way to think about presence is like 1 over the number of times you think about real life. So if you're in VR and you bump into a wall, you've broken presence, sure. But then every time you think about running into a wall, you've also broken presence. If you say something while you're in VR and your voice doesn't reverb back the way it should in the virtual environment, you've broken presence. If your foot touches the wire, you've broken presence. If you think about your foot touching the wire, you've broken presence. If you think about what button you need to press, you've broken presence. So it's this fragile, delicate thing, but if you can get it, I think we get this nearly perfectly ecologically valid behavior out of research subjects. So I want to talk a little bit about pressing buttons. So I was giving a demo of Job Simulator once, and someone was trying to reach under a desk, and they asked me, hey, what's the crouch button? And I had to think for a second. Wait, like, what is the crouch button? Do I know all the buttons in Job Simulator? And then it hit me. I'm like, no, there's no button anymore. You just crouch. Now, it's a valid question because there's always been a crouch button until now. We've always needed one. Video games have always been about pressing buttons. And when I say buttons, I mean any sort of user input. It could be a D-pad, it can be a trigger, it could be a gesture, it could be a swipe. But video games have always been about mapping user input to output. You don't jump in Mario, you press B to jump. There's always this distance between input and output. Now, this distance varies quite a bit between games. The sequence of inputs to Hadouken has nothing to do with shooting a fireball from your hands, but swinging a Wiimote is pretty similar to actually swinging a tennis racket. But there's always a disconnect. It's never been a one-to-one mapping, with rare exceptions until now. My favorite is QuickTime events. QuickTime events are when you have to press a button at a certain time to do something awesome. And if you mess it up, then you will usually fail spectacularly. I've always been fascinated by QuickTime events because it's like the biggest distance ever. Like, all I did was press X. There's always been this huge distance from input to output, with one notable exception. God of War 3 had one particular QuickTime event that always really stuck with me. And the God of War is this hyper-violent action platformer where you play as Kratos, God of War, on a quest for revenge. It's basically Kill Bill, but with the Greek pantheon. At the end of the first level of God of War 3, you gouge out Poseidon's eyes, which just tells you everything you need to know about the God of War franchise. I'm not going to show you that clip, but this is what immediately precedes it. Now, the QuickTime event button prompt here is L3 plus R3. And if you're unfamiliar with the PlayStation controller, that means clicking down the left and the right stick at the same time, which you don't really realize till you do it, but nearly perfectly matches what you'd actually do if you were gouging out someone's eyes. And so when you do it, it was this weirdly uncomfortably powerful event for me. I remember having to pause and put the controller down, like, what just happened? And like take a breath. Because for the first time ever, there was no longer any distance from input to output. I wasn't hitting the eye gouge button, I was gouging out someone's eyes. And I can't say I really liked it, but it was powerful. And it was something I never really experienced before and didn't really get to experience again until VR came around. Because in VR, we get to do this all the time. A good example is Job Simulator, where sure, there's still a button. You still have to press trigger to grab things. But otherwise, you just do stuff. You don't press a button to make coffee. You just make coffee. With fewer consequences. In one level, there's a British robot that asks you to make tea and crumpets. And Job Simulator, over the course of playtesting the game, discovered that people make tea very differently. Most people do it in just the normal way. Put a tea bag in a mug, then pour water in, and then you're done. But some people, depending on their cultural backgrounds, would put the tea bag in the actual kettle while it was boiling, which seems insane to me. But if that's how you make tea, it's important you can do that, whatever the natural response is. Even if it's, yeah. Because as soon as you go to make tea in the natural way and it doesn't work, then this like tragic break in presence happens where you go from making tea to trying to figure out what the make tea button is. And that's not what we're trying to do in VR. In games until now, we've had to press B to jump. In VR, you just jump. I noticed this came to me when I was playing Job Simulator the first time, and I realized that I'd do this trick where like I just pour hot water in and swirl it around and throw it out to warm up the mug, something my dad taught me. And I didn't realize until after I had done it that nothing prompted me to do that. It had no ramification in the game. Because I had presence, it had elicited this totally natural behavior in me. And that's what made me realize, wait, we could do this with research subjects as well. So the projects that I want to tell you about rely on machine learning. And this is a kind of a complicated thing, but I want to use the same example that someone used on me in grad school to help me finally understand it. So all machine learning does is it uses data to predict other data. So let's say you have a machine learning system and you feed it 100 pictures of cats. And every picture has a tag with it that says cat equals 1. There's a cat here. Then you feed it 100 other pictures that don't have cats in them. And every one of these pictures also has a tag that says cat equals 0. There's no cat in this picture. And you feed all this data to the machine learning system. Then you give it a whole new picture that it's never seen before. And you ask it, hey, is there a cat in here? It'll be able to tell you, based on the data you've already given it, no, there's no cat here, I'm 74% sure. Now, instead of 100 pictures, if you fed it 1,000 pictures, it would get more confident. More data equals better prediction for a machine learning system. Now, if you went from 10,000 to 100,000, you might get a little more confident, but not all that much. There's diminishing returns at a certain point. Now, if you were to go back and notice that every picture also has a GPS coordinate of where it was taken, then maybe certain parts of the world have more cats or dogs. This could also improve the confidence. If you notice that every picture also has the name of the city where it was taken, it might help you a little bit, but it doesn't tell you a lot that the GPS coordinate didn't already tell you, so it probably wouldn't help that much. The takeaway is the more relevant, unique sources of signal you can feed to a machine learning system, the better prediction it'll do. Now there's this saying in machine learning, garbage in, garbage out. So if you feed a machine learning system biased, inaccurate data, it will make biased, inaccurate predictions. But if the data's good, then it becomes this totally objective, data-driven way of understanding the world. And I think there's something really beautiful in that. Machine learning doesn't care if you're using pixel values to predict cat or no cat, or if you're using healthcare records to predict, age of cancer onset. It just uses data to predict other data, and that's it. So this is a project that I did with the Vive and on a desktop computer, where we wanted to try to understand if we could use machine learning on brain activity to predict memory. So this is the task. Oops, I can play. There we go. Objects appear and they flash. You have to remember which object is which color. then remember which one was the floor color. And it'll explode if you got it right. So you have to remember which is which, and then you have to remember, okay, which one was green. And the task is adaptively difficult, so it gets harder with more targets the better you do. We wanted to keep everyone at a consistent level of challenge. And so in this study, people did this task either in VR or on a flat monitor with a mouse. And then we had them wear a Muse commercial, just consumer-grade EEG headband. And we looked at brain activity while the objects were flashing, which is called the memory encoding period. This is when your brain sees the stuff it's supposed to remember and encodes it into memory. Then we also fed it the behavioral data from the recall phase of which target they actually picked. Did they get it right or not? And we used a machine learning system, fed it all this data, then had it try to predict, based on brain activity, if you would remember something later. So we had two main hypotheses. The first one was that I thought performance would be better in VR than on a flat screen. And the second was that I thought we could use brain activity during encoding to predict recall above chance. Now it's above chance here because if you're using machine learning to predict the outcome of a coin flip, you'd get half them right anyways, so you have to be above chance. The first hypothesis didn't actually pan out. People's performance was the same across both conditions. In hindsight, I think this is because it wasn't a particularly spatial task, so it didn't really benefit from VR. But whatever, it wouldn't be science if we got them all right. The second one did actually pan out. We were able to statistically predict recall above chance. Here is the brain activity, the average brain activity during encoding for all subjects. This is on the left and the right side, so you can see that the effects are pretty bilateral. Now, the red line is brain activity for when something flashes that you later forget. And the blue lines are brain activity when something flashes that you later remember. And the only important thing here is that they're different, which means a machine learning system can distinguish between the two. This means that in theory, we can predict whether or not you will remember something based on what your brain was doing when you saw it. Now where this gets really interesting for me is this effect basically goes away on a flat screen. People do the same task with the same brain imaging hardware, run the same analysis, they have the same performance, but there's less predictive signal in brain activity on a flat screen. I'm not sure why yet. I think it has something to do with presence, and I'm excited to try to find out. But the important thing in non-VR condition, these two signals are the same, which would be equivalent to training a machine learning system on pictures of bagels and curled up dogs, and then asking it to tell you if this is a puppy or a bagel. It'll be able to tell you, and probably above chance, but not by much. It's much easier when the things it's trying to distinguish between are different. So these results are published in a conference paper. If you reach out to me on Twitter, I'm happy to send you a copy. And I've gotten ethics approval for a follow-up study. I'm just waiting on some neuroscience hardware, where I want to make a few important changes. First, I want to add a third condition, which I'm calling the VR control condition. Now this one, you're in VR, you're wearing a headset, but in VR, you're doing it on a flat monitor with a mouse. This is to try to minimize some of the between group differences and isolate some of the effects of just wearing a big screen on your face. I'm also getting better brain imaging equipment, going from consumer-grade EEG to research-grade EEG plus optical imaging. Only in the past few months have the electrodes gotten thin enough that you can comfortably wear them underneath VR headsets. I can't wait to get my hands on these. I'm also adding in a bunch of other sources of signal, like eye tracking integrated into VR, breathing monitor, heart rate, and 2 different heart rate monitors. As I said, garbage in, garbage out, so better data, better prediction. I think the most significant shift is the way we're using machine learning. In the original study, we just used one group average model for everybody. But everybody's brain is a unique snowflake, and so this time around, we're going to build personalized machine learning models for each person based on a group model, and have these personalized models do their own prediction for each person individually. So in phase 1 of the follow-up, I want to bring people in, have them do the exact same task with all the sensors, then collect all the data, then send them home. And then we construct these models, and then bring them back in for phase 2. Now in phase 2, they do the same task, and half of the trials are the same, just totally normal. A quarter of the trials will be predicted or selected randomly, and those will flash twice. And now anything you see twice, you'll remember better than something you see once. So we'd expect better performance on those random trials. But some of those random trials you would have gotten right anyways. And so 25% of other trials are going to be ones that the personalized machine learning system predicts you'll get wrong. And those ones will also flash twice. And if we can show more performance improvement in the machine learning selected trials than in the randomly selected trials, then that'll validate the idea, prove the concept that we can use personalized machine learning on real-time biometric data to enhance cognition. That's what I'm trying to do. I want to leave you with just a few final thoughts on VR generally. in case it needed saying, VR is not going to be the downfall of society. Some people will abuse this technology, just like people abuse every technology. Just like some people watch too much Netflix and play too much Candy Crush. I mean, we could just whip batteries of people, but we still need batteries. There's also a lot of stuff like this. His brain doesn't know he's not underwater right now. Can you imagine how magical that must be for him? And what if he didn't have access to a real aquarium? Or what if he was in a wheelchair? Or what if his parents couldn't afford to take him? Right, his parents probably could because they can afford a Vive, but you know what I mean. People said of the internet that it democratized information. Well, virtual reality democratizes experience. For the first time ever, we can take a classroom of inner city kids on a field trip to the pyramids at lunch. Now, of course, it'll be the best video games and pornography humanity's ever produced, but that's easy. That's low-hanging fruit. It's already so much more than that. This is a breathing visualization that pulls people out of panic attacks. Anybody who's had a panic attack will tell you it's not the kind of thing you get to just decide to stop having. But according to anecdotal evidence, that's been life-changing for some people. So the point is, the takeaway should be, VR can be whatever we want it to be. It can be a tool for social good. Don't you miss him? It can be a way to raise awareness and foster empathy, and a tool to better understand and communicate the human condition. According to the internet, VR can just be some guy wearing headphones wrong. It can be whatever we want it to be. And it really is up to us to decide what it turns out. So I want to leave you with a quote from IBM Research. Good design is good business. I think these are really words to live by. It doesn't matter if you're doing product design or game design or experimental design. Whatever you're doing, just do good. Oh, thanks. So we have some time for questions. Yeah.
Quick, if you look at head tracking and try to correlate that with your incorrect trials, my worry is that the consumer grade things might be sensitive, like DMT or just any motion, muscle movement. So somebody missing a trial, they might be frustrated or moving, or maybe they weren't paying attention prior to the incorrect trial.
We did standard artifact correction for eye blinks and head movements. I can't say we looked specifically at just if general head movement correlated with correct incorrect, but yeah, we did standard just cleaning.
But
yeah.
Sure. On that is the illusion of presence. I mean, I think we can all agree that presence is right now an ideal, and that I love the metaphor you're doing. It brings it very close to the attention literature that as long as you can provide this engagement that puts somebody in the illusion of presence for the moment, then they get the experience. And I think that we need to work very hard at the other modalities, particularly haptics, because there's so many things on the force out of presence right now that for those in the room who want to grab those resources, start looking at tactile feedback as much as you can, start looking at full body.
Yeah, sure. Personally, I think that the next modality to go after, the one that has the strongest implications, is hearing. Yeah. If with a pair of OSIC headphones on, like people will put on a VR headset, close their eyes, point at something, and it's there every time. If you can get that together with the visuals, you get way more presence instantly. Anybody? Yeah, in the back. The study that I mentioned, the stress and cognition one, I mean, it's actually a commonly used paradigm. If I bought some boards in the hardware store and put them down. They thought it might be too kind of scary for some people. The level of arousal would be too high. Maybe someone would have a heart attack. I don't know. IBM Research is full of old folks. But otherwise, it's been pretty good. I mean, we take a lot of precautions. We use, disposable hygienic covers for the VR headset. We have people do like a preliminary thing. They can stop at any time. I'd say overall, it's been fine. Yeah.
Yeah. So I was interested in distraction as a possible explanatory uncontrolled factor with the VR. So thinking about if you did something with the flat screen, the intention that people in the front of
No, we didn't include anything like that. I mean, we tried to keep it pretty consistent across the conditions, but I mean, I think that's one of the strengths of VR actually, is you get to control and remove distractions. Like we know exactly what they saw the whole time because we put it there.
Don't know what they were attending to.
That's true.
And with the richer environment of VR, there may be more of a propensity to not be looking at the target because you're exploring this novel space.
I mean, it was a pretty simple space. I think if anything, people would have gotten more distracted on the flat monitor because they were in a lab, they're in a room with other things to look at. In VR, there's nothing else to look at. Anything else? Questions? Yeah.
I really appreciate it. The follow-up study you were mentioning that you're adding the 30
Mhm.
Some of the sort of 2D flat screen interactions within the 30
Sure.
There's so many things that are different in VR. Yeah, there's a sense of presence, but it's created by a lot of factors, and the actual controls themselves are different. So I'm curious, in adding that third condition,
Yeah, so what we want to do here is try to tease apart any effects that are VR specific and ones that are just general. And so with this third, if we just have VR, non-VR, we get an effect in one but not in the other. We don't know if it's specific to VR or if it's just a general thing. Versus in this other condition, like for example, breathing rate. I have a specific hypothesis for that. There was a cool study that found that we have better recall for things that are presented during peak inhale, which I found just fascinating. So I want to test that, and that's something that I wouldn't expect to change from VR to non-VR. Versus, according to the results from the first study, brain activity was more predictive in VR than non-VR. So that's one that I would expect to see in the VR condition, but not in the VR control or in the flat monitor. So yeah, we do have some specific condition-specific hypotheses. Yeah. In the pilot study, this is a confound actually that we're fixing for the follow-up. In the pilot study, on the flat monitor condition, they used a mouse, and in the VR, they used a Vive controller, which has a lot of between group differences. So in the follow-up, every condition uses mouse, even VR. Yeah.
You commented on maintaining presence by engaging with interaction as possible, but you still, of course, figure out because you have to specify to check that out. You see any new directions for like tracking and looking like that?
I mean, I've used Leap Motion for a while, and I even got to use their newer one lately. No. I mean, it's going to be, yes, but it'll take a while. We're nowhere close to that right now. You can use hand tracking, and it's pretty good most of the time, but our proprioception is so good that if anything is even the slightest bit off, it just ruins it. I firmly believe that in VR, especially, it's better to give no information than wrong information. So I wouldn't want to use any sort of hand tracking system that does that. I'm in the middle of trying to order these so Leap Motion is an optical hand tracking system. So there's a sensor here, it like looks at your hands, which has a lot of problems with range and occlusion. Like if your hands are like this, it doesn't know what you think you're doing. But I'm trying to order a pair of mechanical hand tracking gloves that just have like bendable sensors in them, and those don't have any of the same problems. So that helps a little bit, but you still don't have any of the force feedback that I know we all want so badly. And those like Dexmo mechanical gloves, I mean, those are just terrifying. I think it'll be a while until that comes out. Yeah. There's a little rumble. In the pilot study, there was a little rumble when you got it right, but otherwise, no. And in the follow-up, there will not be. We want to try to minimize group differences. Okay, thanks a lot.